So welcome everyone, and thanks very much for coming to this panel, New Ways to Tell Climate Stories. My name is Blanca Begert, and I'm an editor and producer for the environment section of KCET's website. KCET is a public television station affiliated with PBS SoCal, serving Southern California. So the topic of this panel is New Ways to Tell Climate Stories. And I'll just quickly introduce it by saying that over the past several years, the conversation around telling climate stories has really moved from trying to show that climate change is real to getting people to engage with the issue and understand solutions and act. And we know, though, that with the complex and systemic and at times overwhelming nature of the problem, as well as distrust in media and science, that engaging people can be difficult. And so I'm very excited to introduce this panel of storytellers and thinkers that have what I believe are some very helpful insights about how to tell effective and ethical climate stories that can open people's minds and draw them in and point to better futures. So I'll start with introducing the panel. Allison Begalman is an LA-based writer and activist working in the narrative change sector. She's the CEO of Impact, a social impact consulting agency, and co-founder and executive producer of the Hollywood Climate Summit, which is coming up at the end of the month, which I'm sure she'll speak to. She co-founded Young Entertainment Activists and the USC Feminist Media Festival. She was one of the writers of the Good Energy Stories Playbook, which helps creators explore the climate emergency. And she also writes for television and film. Then next to her, we have Edward Humes. Ed is a Southern California-based Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of 15 books. His most recent book is Burned, A Story of Murder and the Crime That Wasn't, which came out in January 2018. And before that, he wrote Door to Door, The Magnificent, Maddening, Mysterious World of Transportation, and Garbology, Our Dirty Love Affair with Trash, which has been a campus-wide read at universities and colleges nationwide. And he received a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the military for the Orange County Register paper, and a PEN Award for his book, No Matter How Loud I Shout. And then last but not least, John Christensen. John teaches and conducts multidisciplinary research at UCLA, focusing on equity and the environment, strategic environmental communication, journalism, media, and storytelling. At UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, he is a founder of the Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies, and he's also an executive producer of Earth Focus, which is a documentary news show that I have the pleasure of working with him a bit on, which is produced by KCET and PBS. And he has been an environmental journalist also and a science writer for more than 30 years, with work appearing in the New York Times and Nature and High Country News and many other outlets. So those are our exciting panelists. And so I guess, unlike maybe some of the other panels today, we're going to do this a little bit more as a conversational panel, and definitely also invite the audience if you want to join the conversation or have questions as we're talking to just chime in anytime. But so it'll be more like questions and talking about different topics. And before we start that, I would like to ask each of you to share a little bit about your work, what you're working on now, and in particular the ways that you're thinking about telling climate stories and kind of pushing the envelope on how climate stories can and should be told. So if we could just start. You want to start? Allison?
Okay, cool. Hey, Allison Begalman, my pronouns are she, her. I think I want to start by saying that I think all the work I do, my goal is to look at climate storytelling through the lens of intersectionality, and same with my company. I think, at the end of the day, this issue intersects with many different other issues, right? I'm a queer woman, so like queer rights, gender justice, racial justice, disability, advocacy, like all of those things are intersecting because these are the people, black and brown folks, people who are indigenous are on the front lines, like all these issues, again, are intersectional. So at the end of the day, I think that's the forefront of where I like to, do work within the issue and through the lens. But at the end, so basically my work is I run a social impact agency, and I started that because I was a TV writer. That was how I began. I was on the path to build in that career space, and then I ended up starting this organization called Young Entertainment Activists because from in my college days I was doing community organizing and entertainment, and I noticed that there wasn't really a space for young people in entertainment to come together and talk about social issues and political issues, and that was a big problem in my mind because ultimately people were coming into the industry, young people, and this was like a little bit after Me Too. They were coming in being like, I want to use my platform for social justice, for impact, and that was a very much a shift from before that. So I was like, okay, well, if these people are coming in wanting to make impact, they need to know that there are other people like them who care, because we're still in an industry that is very patriarchal, that is serious power inequities, not a lot of intergenerational relationship building, and so that's why we started Young Entertainment Activists, and that was like early 2019, so a couple years ago, but it just grew very quickly because people wanted that space. We were doing a lot of big events where we would bring celebrities and we would bring social justice leaders in LA and nationally, and we'd pass the microphone to the social justice leaders. Obviously there's community building, and so at this point there's like 5,000 people in the industry who are part of, like coming to the events in the community. And then in May of 2020, we started the Hollywood Climate Summit, and this was, of course, like right after COVID. It was supposed to be in person at UTA, and then it ended up being digital, but that was actually a good thing because it took the sort of LA community and made it international. We had folks from tons of different countries come, 15,000 people engaged in our first summit, and at the end of the day, like what we wanted to do with this summit was make it focus on grassroots leadership and knowledge, and that's what I want to also bring to this conversation in terms of storytelling, is really thinking about like how can you first be like, okay, this story, like how are we approaching it from that lens? How are we going to that leadership? How are we approaching that leadership? Do they have time to talk to us? Like all that good stuff. So fast forward, then started the company. We're on year 3 of the summit, and I'll talk more about it later, but yeah.
Sure, okay, thanks. My name's Edward Humes, and as you heard, I was formerly a newspaper reporter. I've been writing books and magazine pieces for a while now, and the focus has been split between criminal justice stories and environmental stories that I'm most interested in. And book I wrote a few years ago called Garbology, or Dirty Love Affair with Trash, kind of was, it sort of was in a place where a lot of our earlier climate stories where we were trying to quantify the problem and sort of reveal things that are beneath the surface for most people. In the case of that story, of the wastefulness that's embedded in all the things that we do every day and aren't fully aware of. For whatever reason, my trashy book was the most popular thing I've written, apparently. So I spoke at a lot of colleges, and what really excited them was this conjunction of stories, of ideas where an environmental good, a climate good, also matched up with an economic benefit or a health benefit or a way that they could marshal the considerable resources of the community that is a college campus to sort of affect change by how they have the school purchase things, or where they got their power from, or how they source their food. And the energy that came out, the ideas that were coming to me from them, as well as interested in what I had to say, was tremendous. So right now I'm just starting on a sequel to that book. It's been 8 years since it came out. So my publisher says, when are you gonna, everybody liked that book, will you get back to this already? So, and the focus this time, as we're seeing with our climate storytelling, is now I want to push more towards communities and individual actions, because we're certainly not going to get it from Washington, or perhaps even from many state governments, but the finding stories that counteract the fatalism a lot of people have for big issues like climate or like mass people throw up their hands and say it's just too big for me to have any impact on it is not true. I don't think it's accurate, and I think that finding ways to tell those stories and to draw people into feeling like it's not futile to do some of the things that need to be done to ameliorate the worst aspects of climate change has to be mission number one for journalists and storytellers that are interested in climate change. I've been thinking about this since I first found out we were going to be together on this panel, and I had this idea that our storytelling about climate is kind of like the 5 stages of grief. Different parts of the population are in different places on that. There's the denial and the anger aspect that we began with. I see that as the inconvenient truth era that many of us are past, but not certainly large swaths of the nation are still stuck in that spot. So we do still have to tell those stories, but the rest of us are somewhere between the bargaining and the depression and acceptance and trying to find a way to move forward, and we need stories that speak to people who are in that place as well. And that's what I'm going to be trying to do with this project. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Between bargaining and depression. I feel you. I feel it. I thought I would like to just start by asking who you all are in the audience, and maybe just by a show of hands. I mean, how many of you are journalists? Okay, what, some other kind of science writer, communicator?
PIO.
PIO? Yeah. And anything else I've missed?
Cartoonist.
Cartoonist. Great.
Wait, where's the
TV
cartoonist?
writer.
What's that?
Oh, TV writer.
TV writer. Cool.
Scientist.
What?
Scientist.
A scientist.
Same.
Scientist. Cool. So I just finished teaching a course. The course I teach every year called Environmental Journalism, Science Communication, and New Media, which has really evolved over the 10 years now I've been at UCLA, into a strategic environmental communications course, because I have 105 students from all over campus. Half of them are environmental science students, and half of them are from everywhere else, and probably, maybe 1 or 2, 3 at the most will become journalists, but there's probably a dozen or so who will be professionally some kind of communicator, and they're all passionate about science and the environment and climate change, and then there's probably half of them who won't be in some kind of professional communications role, but will work in teams where it's important to communicate with each other and more broadly. So what I hope to do is to give them the tools that they can communicate, they can take out into the world and communicate well in whatever they're doing, and also understand how to work with communicators, with journalists, with PIOs. And I teach them, it's evolved to where I teach them 3 things: empathy, narrative, and strategy. And empathy, and that's kind of one of the surprising ones, but one that I think the students most like, is about understanding your audience, and understanding, trying to understand, making the effort to understand their frames, narratives, and values, the way they see the world, the stories they tell about themselves in the world, and what they care about, what matters to them. And all of those things are kind of wrapped up in what we call identity, that our frames, narratives, and values really kind of form how our identities and how we see ourselves. And they're super important for how we receive and process information, or ignore it, or the stories that matter to us. And and I think this has been shown in environmental communication and science communication, climate communication research. It's what the Science Literacy Foundation, I think, calls the kind of new science literacy, is understanding that we're not, we're no longer in a world where we, thank goodness, where we think that there's an information deficit, and by filling that deficit, we're going to solve the problems. It's really about understanding these things like about our audiences, their frames, narratives, and values, and how to communicate across those. And I would just recommend the white paper and website of the Science Literacy Foundation is a really great place to start. There's a deep literature here, but it's a good place to start with this. We're just starting on, well, we're actually kind of well into planning the new Bible and the next 3 seasons, so 28 episodes of Earth Focus, the documentary news magazine. So I'm kind of deep into like, how do we tell those stories? And so I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts and your questions that would inform that. We did and we're changing things up, and it's been fun to work on that show because we've been trying to change from the kind of traditional environmental storytelling or science storytelling, first to really focus on people and communities, which has always been my focus as an environmental journalist and science writer, is looking at it through the lens of people and communities. But we haven't really, I don't know if we did get there a lot. Our last season focused on the environmental and social determinants of health. But when we did a focus group, on the show, one of the answers that we got, or observations that we got that really kind of cut to the quick was, oh, this is a show for liberals who believe in science. And I was like, I'm a liberal who believes in science, but I'm like, I'm not doing this for myself, and so, now, our Bible is kind of, revolving around, words like curiosity, exploration, a journey, and even, in some cases, a sense of humor, and hoping to get to what Monica Guzman, a journalist, writes in a really great book that I recommend to you all as well, called I Never Thought of It That Way. That's the reaction that we want to hope to evoke in our audiences, is at the end of a story, I never thought of it that way. And it's also, in Monica Guzman's book, it's also a process for having these kinds of conversations across the divides that we have. I think, as you all probably know, environment and climate are 2 of the most polarizing words in the American political lexicon. If I ask you what you think about the environment or climate, I can probably predict, how you vote. Republican or Democrat. I would just say kind of one more observation is that the LA Times and UC Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies recently did a poll, a statewide poll and a representative poll in the city of Los Angeles as well. And the percentage of people who said that climate was one of their top 2 concerns is between 10 and 13%. And Sammy Roth, who's speaking in the other room right now, called me up and asked me, what I thought about this, and I said, well, the bad news is that. But the good news is that, the bad news is that because the other important issues were homelessness, housing affordability, and crime and public safety. And for many of us, if you're walking around the city, driving around, it's not surprising that those are the top issues. But that said, people do believe the consequences are serious. heat, wildfires, air pollution, and they favor doing things to address those threats by large majorities. Limit new housing in high-risk wildfire areas, high-speed rail, bus lanes and bike lanes, metro rail, trees and parks, and a little bit, not planting in the median strips, a little bit less so, about half are in favor of getting rid of their gas stoves, or banning gas stoves, which is a direction we're moving, and limiting agricultural water. So, Sammy asked me, how come the candidates the candidates for mayor are not talking about climate change? And I was, well, they read the polls too. But they should be, they could be talking about, public transportation, good public transportation, trees and shades and parks, and, conserving waters and these other issues that people are concerned about and care about. And that, so it kind of led to the idea that, maybe the best way to tell stories about climate is not to mention the word.
And I think that you brought that up when we talked before the panel, and I feel like, Allison, you agreed that I think you even said that the best way to tell climate stories is to not even mention the word climate. Maybe you'd like to expand on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that it's about, and this is my managers, I also write TV, I don't remember if I mentioned this, but my managers are always telling me to hide the spinach. And at first it annoyed me, because I was like, but I'm a social impact writer, but I think, unfortunately, all of us in this room are on the same page about what needs to happen and that we all need to be doing this work. And folks in power, especially in the entertainment industry and media places, are seeing climate as, you say the word, and it's political. So how can we sort of work within the system to change it? We can stop using the verbiage that scares them. Like, they even are scared of the word activist, and I've been told that before by ESG departments. And so I think for us, it's like we have to find new ways. Instead of saying climate, we're talking about the character, and we're talking about the world and the location, and all of that has climate in it. And at the end of the day, that's gonna get someone to wanna engage with your story more than hearing that, until the word is depoliticized, if it ever is. So that would be, and I also think there's other words, like even saying like alternative futures, like future then goes to like sci-fi, people might think, oh, futuristic, but no, we don't wanna be telling more sci-fi. We've had enough of climate sci-fi stories. You don't need the apocalyptic kind of stuff anymore. So to me, it's like, if you're gonna say futures, you would say grounded, anything that's grounded, or like near future. I wouldn't, so those are the types of things that I think a lot of folks who are telling news stories right now are thinking about. How can we trick executives into not thinking that we have an agenda? And I'm sure it is the same with other types of publications as well. So that's my 2 cents.
I like the hide the spinach approach. I mean, I think science writing in general, it's much easier to tuck the science part of a story into a larger narrative than before the reader even knows it. They've learned something they probably thought they were afraid of or hated. Climate's a lot like that. I mean, one of the issues I think people are much more incensed about is plastic pollution, right? I mean, everyone, at least anecdotally, gets very, particularly in California, people very aroused, the beaches and their waters. Well, I mean, plastic is the next big play of the fossil fuel industry, and just in case those EVs do catch on, they're going to have plastic to fall back on, and it's a huge threat, and it isn't directly tied to climate, among other things, as all our other activities have a climate aspect to the story. So when we're telling those, you don't need to hit people over the head about it. You focus on the things that they do want to learn about and do something about, and it just so happens that it'll align with less impact on the climate as well most of the time. And that's an effective storytelling trick. It is a trick.
It is a trick.
We had, oh, sorry.
Oh, was just gonna say, although, I mean, in some cases, I think you can tell an interesting story about how the spinach gets made. You know, if it's a story of you know, discovery. It's the way that we're kind of learning, leaning rather, is, you know, we don't want to tell simplistic stories. We want to tell complex stories that engage the viewers in that discovery that the solutions are complicated, and in some interesting ways. Like, yeah, to have EVs, we need, you know, there's going to be lots of plastic in them to keep them lighter. There's going to be lithium that needs to be mined or, you know, gotten out of the Salton Sea, which is another, you know, kind of interesting, you know, potential story. And, you know, that the pollution that comes from traffic, as a Guardian story about some science, you know, just revealed, is, you know, that the pollution that comes off of tires, the micro pollution that comes off of tires and is airborne because it's so small, is actually orders of magnitude worse than the tailpipe emissions now. Mm-hmm. And I always thought, like, I sort of thought, oh, EVs are going to be the solution, right? Like, it's okay, it's going to be okay for all these apartments to be right next to the freeways in LA in 10, 20 years because there won't be any more tailpipe emissions. And it's like, nope, you know?
Brake dust. Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Big Dust.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, verbal trickery is dependent upon, as you started by saying, who we talking to, and who we pandering, excuse me. You know,
so I prefer not to think of it as pandering, but as knowing your audience.
Yes, knowing your audience, and I'm not sure who we're talking to relative to how you sort of carve up the approach, what messaging you use, and how you develop the, you know, messaging, what words you use. But in that context, are you, as journalists, now needing to play a different role in this context? Well, you're not just teaching, but you're explaining and helping people understand things, rather than sort of telling them this is something you should be concerned about. And the rationale behind this foundation, Science Literacy Foundation, was about the how and the why, not the what. So when you are describing these issues, as you're describing them in Hiding the Spinach, are the audiences not capable of learning through your investigative method? Because I just believe that science journalists are the ultimate arbiters of seeking the truth and teaching people how to find it themselves, right? So you're giving them the pathway to get there on their own, but not necessarily, you know, hitting them over the head, you know, too hard and saying this is what you should consider and believe.
Yeah, that's where we've arrived, you know, is that, you know, we're not about preaching solutions. Our audience, we believe, you know, is very smart, you know, and they want to be taken on a journey of discovery by people that they believe, by journalists that they believe they can trust. And I think, you know, that's where I get a little bit concerned about, you know, that's where I think that the practices of objectivity, of being able to trace your sources, you know, being fair, not hiding the ball if you find evidence that contradicts your argument or your story, you have to deal with it, you know, being candid, understanding your own positionality, all those practices of objectivity. We maybe can't be objective, but we can practice these practices of objectivity, and I think our audiences know that, and that the trust in science, in scholarship, in journalism, all depend on those things.
But when you write the
and
story,
it just could, if I could, well, go ahead. I lost it.
oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying, but when you write the story, is there an action that you're expecting from the people, right? You're giving them some data information, how to think. And are they supposed to do something? Or just learn something and then go on to the next story?
I think people need to do something at this point. Why are we, like, you have to learn and do at the same time. You gotta figure it out. Like, we just don't have the time to waste, in my opinion. And I think something, again, I am not a science journalist, so I'm not framing it in that way, but I think it is similar in storytelling. It's, you know, we need to be tracking better tracking the way we're developing stories and how that is affecting people and what they're doing post that, right? Like, how can we create, how can we see the KPIs of someone reading your article and, okay, they read your article, what did they do after that? There needs to be a better system to integrate that. Otherwise, it's like, we don't actually know if it's working. So I say yes, and I think that it needs to be a bigger discussion at with all the stakeholders, whether it's a studio, a Hollywood studio, whether it's The Guardian, they need to be thinking about that, and maybe they are, but that's my 2 cents on it.
I want to edit myself because I'm a writer and I need an editor. When to hide the spinach, what I really mean is delay the spinach, because narrative writing is an exercise in trust, and so you bring your reader or your viewer or your listener in until they realize they can trust you that you're going to take them somewhere they want to go, and then they'll stick with you, and then you can say, and by the way, here's the spinach, and here's why, and I want to explain to you why this is important. You have to build towards it. You have to unfold the story in a way that first they're comfortable, and then you can talk about whatever you want if you do it well. And so at the end of a story in which climate is a subtext or a theme or the major point, yes, Allison and John are right. You want them to feel not only that they need to act, but given them a path to act in some way. But it's the other thing too. They're also going to learn something from the story if you're doing your job that they didn't know before. Otherwise, why read it if they knew everything in there already? Right? Why even bother?
I mean, for me, I think that's where strategy comes in. Empathy, narrative, and strategy. That's where the strategy part is. Like, what are you trying? And I think journalists often don't like to think about this. That they're being strategic in some way. But I think we all are. We all have some kind of theory of change, and so what are the outcomes and impact that you're looking for, and how do you get there? That's to return to what I was going to say. I do worry about starting, and this is another part of our Bible. We're not going to start with solutions. We want to explore problems and get there, perhaps, but we're not going to start with like, oh, we have the answers. And I do think that there's a risk in some of the communications and journalism around climate of starting with the presumption that we know the answer, and that can cut off that exploration. I know I was hoping at this and I proposed to the organizers that Sammy Roth and I could have an interesting conversation about that, because he's publicly declared that he's biased in a sense. That he believes he believes there's a crisis, and that we have to achieve these certain solutions. And I think he may be I think he's right about that. But I think there's a danger in undermining really undermining the ability to communicate if somebody looks at what you do and says something like, oh, that's for liberals who believe in science. I already know what you're going to say about that. It doesn't make for a very interesting story.
Do you think it's sort of the audience detecting a motive that you have prior to allowing them to figure out, what they're about to learn?
Yeah, I think they might feel you manipulated.
Yeah, like you've already shown your hand, and just because of like the nature of what the piece is.
And I think we've seen, and it's obviously not just due to what scientists are doing, but I think we're seeing the increasing politicization of science. The polarization. There's increasing polarization around science itself, which is very alarming to me.
Yeah, I mean, my question as a layman, to this space is, when I go and read a story or watch something, it is inherently to like discover and learn, and, you know, the story could be just about something about life, something about, you know, the dark, like maybe the dark side of like the human condition or something like that. But to me, I'm excited to go into it knowing that I'm not sure what's going to come out of it. And so, like, for writers trying to tell stories around particularly the environment, I feel like you're almost like the chips are stacked a little bit against you in the beginning because of the frame that you're going into it with. You're trying to translate something that potentially that there is this motive for that person to act on something, whether even though they may just want to arrive and learn. So I guess to me is that like a bit of a paradigm shift? I know, you know, there's been documentaries going on forever and stuff like that, but it seems like there's a shift towards storytellers taking upon themselves to try and take on this huge task of education in a more overt way because of what's happening? Or like, do you feel that there's a sea change at all, or is it more just about how do we not inundate people with?
I mean, what we've heard is, I haven't watched all of them, but you know, the chief creative officer at KCET, Juan Davis, was judging a contest of like climate and environment documentaries, and he said it was just like relentless preaching.
Yeah.
And the same thing over and over and
Yeah.
over.
Scolding and preaching are not effective, I don't think.
Yeah, it seems like there's a bit of exhaustion from like the next Will Smith narrated, you know, something around the world, showing something that was reported on a while ago, and there's no like answer. I mean, it's just like one of the biggest narrative challenges I can see.
You probably won't get Will Smith for a while.
But I mean, I hope everybody in the room would like take it. I mean, we're trying to do it. I don't have the answers. It's like explore new ways.
Yeah.
You know, and
But
try
I think
new
that's
things.
where creativity comes
Yeah.
in, and that's what I think, like, to me, I love TikTok. I think it's an incredible platform. I think you have really, really smart people there, and like, young people are using that as their way to learn.
Yeah.
I learned this on TikTok. I heard this on TikTok. It's literally, they're citing it like a Bible. And I think if science writers are coming to those platforms and sharing the information and being creative and funny, you know? Like, how can we add some comedy in there? I'm gonna be so honest that most people I know don't even read the newspaper, read magazines anymore. They read the headlines, and you guys all know that. And, you know, it's because we're all overburdened and fatigued and our brains are on fire from Zoom. So I think, you know, like, we just have to be more creative and flexible. And also, I think the other thing that I'm seeing, at least from the industry and entertainment, is like the niche. Like, there's so many, they're really targeting shows now to like, oh, okay, like, gay men in like Oklahoma love your show, cool. Like, we're gonna target, like, I'm just making that up, obviously, but they're really targeting. And so I think, you know, if you as a reporter, you know, learn that, oh, okay, your audience is this and it's a small niche, just go to that and push that, because other people can handle other things. You don't need to like be popular by everybody. You just need to hit that niche, hit it well, and track what's happening. So I don't know, I really think creativity at the end of the day needs to be, and nonfiction and fiction, it's the same.
I like the humor idea. I've been thinking for a while we need the Archie Bunker of climate change. You know, if you can make fun of it, then you've moved forward in a way that we really need.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, stand-up comedians, like, it's the coalition building among the creative community is really key.
I'm curious how you all sort of think about a little bit more about storytelling or reporting on solutions, because I mean, I appreciate the point we don't want to lead with solutions, or like that could some sort of presume a certain like attitude from the audience, but I also know from those focus groups and from lots of studies, and you know, that we hear so much that, you know, audiences are very overwhelmed and don't, you know, are very, can't handle the gloom and doom, and that like solutions or a more positive take or humor or something is kind of like the way to get people involved, and yet there's so many ways that you can go wrong with a focus on solutions, like focusing on the wrong ones, or being Pollyanna-ish, or seeming like you're pushing an agenda. And so yeah,
great panel this morning, Native American stories that are about climate, and one of the tribal leaders was telling a story about how for many years along the Klamath River basin, members of the Yurok and Kuruk tribes were doing these low intensity controlled burns. I'm talking about 100 years ago of overgrown wooded areas, and that it suppressed the wildfire problem, and it sometimes the smoke would, he was explaining how it would create an inversion layer that would cool off the waters of the Klamath River, and was good for the salmon that they depend upon. About 100 years ago, those ancient practices were outlawed, and they literally, if they caught any members of the tribe doing it, they, meaning the surrounding white population, they'd shoot them in order to stop them from setting fire to things. And now, fast forward 100 years later, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state and others are coming back to the tribe and saying, can you tell us about your sort of tribal ecological knowledge and practices? And that's actually happening now, and it's part of this larger story about the great and damning dams on the Klamath that are being taken down now, mostly through the activism of these tribes. That's a great story about solutions. It's a great story about people, and it's something I learned today that I didn't know about, and that hits all the storytelling successful points for me, and it's a story I want to learn more about. So those are the kinds of things we need to look for. I mean, who wouldn't read that if you didn't know about it, or even if you used to love it? It's just compelling, amazing story.
I think for me, the hope and the comedy element, I want to like lean into that a little bit. And my partner Allie's here, and she's also a climate storyteller, and we went to, I'm just going to give an example of a climate story that could be funny, you know. So we went to my cousin's wedding in December, and it was in Malibu, like Pacific Palisades area, and there had been the biggest rainfall that there had been in a couple months that day of the wedding. And that had caused a mudslide that was like affecting people arriving to the wedding and whatever. So it was a whole big thing, and she's the kind of like bridezilla that you don't want that to happen to. And also there's a big COVID surge, so which is also a part of a climate issue as well, right? So I think, you know, for that, it's a rom-com about the bride, you know, and the family and what happens to the chaotic wedding, and the guests can't get there, and there's so much character in there, and there's so much, you know, what's the theme, you know, there's so many different pieces, but and then obviously we're looking at what happens in California when these things happen. So I think there's a lot there, and that's how you can sort of lean into the comedy of it. Of course, it doesn't mean that every single piece of it needs to be funny. Like, maybe some people were affected negatively, could have gotten hurt from that experience. There could have been a car accident, like a lot of those things. But I think what we need to be learning about comedy is that it's also tragic, and I think we need to lean into more that, like, as much as we want to make the climate emergency feel hopeful and feel comedic, there's also always going to be tragedy in that, and however we can balance those things, where comedy maybe is a little bit higher up, is how I think we'll be successful in that type of storytelling.
That made me think of something. I'm sure all of you saw this. In Silver Lake, there was a bobcat, a cougar, that was running around the neighborhood, and people were just like so fascinated by it, and like it would show up on somebody's porch like at midnight. Somebody would see it across the street, and it's, you know, it's this well-known cougar because it's tagged, but it just generated this huge interest. And again, it just brings up these issues about the wildlife interface that we are dealing with in major cities. I mean, when I was driving here this morning, I saw a coyote, you know, cross the street when I was coming up over the hill. And I just think, you know, I like what you're saying about being more creative and trying to get people to think about these things, and that humor is sometimes really effective, because that was just a huge story. Mm-hmm. And then that, like, Times picked it up, and, you know, it's just interesting.
And I think that's really interesting, and one other thing is I think a really important theme that we should be talking more about in our storytelling that can be more hopeful is really talking about how human-centered our world is, and even speaking to that, you know, why is it, at the end of the day, like, the earth isn't gonna die, like, we're gonna die, right? Like, and so, but we're always the ones who are, like, the hero of the story, and, like, maybe in that story, like, the coyote's the hero of the story, like, I don't know.
Right, the survivor.
Yeah, exactly, so I think that's something we need to be considering more in the way we're putting things out.
So, you know, we're human-centered, but people love animal stories. I was just gonna add one thing to the conversation about solutions. I would put an R and an E in front of that and say that in stories, people want resolutions. You have in narrative, you know, you have a complication and some kind of resolution. It doesn't mean that it has to be the solution to everything. I mean, a resolution can be people just taking some kind of action to solve that complication. A step forward can be a resolution. It doesn't have to be the final, you know, the final destination. You don't have to figure out the final destination or that solution. And so I think that can lead to some more open-ended, you know, ideas about how to talk about solutions. I mean, because I think we did find in our focus groups that people want solutions. So how do you how do you get to those? Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had a question that was actually sort of related to what you were just talking about, but also related to what Allison was talking about earlier, which is that, like, is there any way to track it? Like, if the story has this resolution that makes people inspired to X, like, is there any way, like, is there a way when you're having a fictional TV show where you're hiding the spinach, how can you track if it's having an effect?
Wow, so many things. My co-founder Sam is here, and he is our chief of impact. And Sam, the question that Lisa just had was, how do you track, like, the impact of a story, of an action item in a climate story?
Well, I just think that it's very important to think that, you know, media has changed a lot in the last 50 years. I mean, we now have a landscape that is very niche and that it targets very specific communities, and those indicators are going to vary based on age, gender, community, socioeconomic status. So I feel like obviously you have the quantitative data and the qualitative data, but it's going to be very different what modern family means to me as a gay man in America that maybe what it means to you. You know? So I think that is the magic of social impact, is that when you give storytelling an opportunity to uplift narratives that have been excluded or marginalized, then those people see that representation as an advancement to their cause. And others can understand, can maybe be curious, can maybe build relationships that just didn't happen before, you know? And that's the thing about impact. It can be good or it can be bad. I mean, we know that the stereotypes are in big major part social impact of storytelling. So I think it really depends on the theory of change and the genre.
And usually when you do that, you track outputs. So like when we're developing a campaign, we literally, like, or, you know, and I tell my students, I also teach at USC, a social impact class, and I say, okay, you have a story idea, cool. What is your theory of change? Your ultimate goal that you probably won't achieve, right? And what are the actual measurable goals that you can track? And then what are the outputs? Oh, okay, like, number of, you know, politicians who I got to read my thing and, you know, what their feedback was. Like, that's an output. Like, number of social media engagements, that's an output. And, you know, I think that gets into a more complicated discussion about if you're getting funding for that. And, you know, a lot of the funders want to see those outputs, but you can track it, and you just have to be creative with what you're looking at. And I saw a couple people.
So I just say, I mean, I think the key thing, and this I try to teach my students, is, you know, you can find this anywhere on, you know, lots of places on the web. It's like a logic model or a theory of change, you know, where you're looking at what are your outputs, what are the outcomes you're looking for, and what's the ultimate impact that you're looking for. And just the act of going through that and defining it will get you to focus on what are those outcomes and impacts, and then you can start measuring them. And it can be qualitative or quantitative, you know, but just thinking that way is the first step. Thinking strategically about narratives.
But you can also see examples of that in media we have now, including in fictional literature. Like if any of you read the book Weather, Jenny Offill didn't just say, here's my book of climate anxiety for you to read. If you flip the page at the back, she has a website for you to go to with impact, like that she could use for impact metrics. It's like you can say, oh, how many people after they read this book went to my website and clicked on these things, and did they sign up for this newsletter? Did they sign up for this action item? And she had a bunch of resources for the climate crisis. And it's like you can do that with anything. Or like even if you look at someone like Lil Dicky, who made that music video called Earth, which is very entertaining if you want to check it out, but he linked it to an entire website about the climate crisis and engaging young people. And like you can take all of those things and all those clicks and all those signups and use that as impact metrics. And it's like that's what we do at Yeah to convince people to engage with us, because we're like, look, these people are on social media, they are doing these things, and this is proof that people want to learn more, and you should be putting your money in these places and putting this information out there. So it already exists, and I think it's a lot about convincing these companies to include those impact sites at the end of the TV show you watch or the book you read. You know, people want more information on these things.
It's like it's called a call to action.
Yes. Exactly.
Yes.
Do you have a way to track beyond the social media engagement or website clicks to things like purchases, votes, kind of, and I don't mean just online purchases, like people going to a location, people voting, that type of, people signing up to be poll workers, or other things in the real world that are not just virtual engagement?
I think you need a real research. I mean, to me, it's like if you set the impact strategy up to track, let's say you have a story that's a film about like civic engagement, right? And that ultimately is your goal as a filmmaker, and but it's a narrative piece, and your goal is, okay, I want to get 50,000 people to register to vote from my film. That's my goal, right? To me, you're going to have to develop an impact strategy that is going to literally interview thousands of people or track thousands of people, not in a creepy way, right? In order to find out if they did that, right? Like what we do after our events is we send out big surveys, right? And they're short and they're fun and they're quippy and they're like, here's, a code to get this free thing afterwards, right? You have to incentivize people, but I think you really have to build your impact strategy even before you write the thing, if that's your goal, to be able to track that within a research study, surveys, etc. I don't think you could, unless it's a huge film like Don't Look Up, which I think a lot of organizations came out and was like, oh my god, like people really were talking about that afterwards. I think unless it's a huge big blockbuster, it's much harder to get those kinds of answers naturally. You would have to really design for it.
Who hasn't asked a question?
To build a little bit on her example of the Silver Lake cougar, that's a fantastic story of how this one cougar who lives in Griffith Park, somehow, God bless him, he managed to cross all the freeways and live in Griffith Park. He's P22. Well, his picture was captured in front of a Hollywood sign, and National Geographic put him on the cover, and it's now this iconic story about the one cougar who lives in Griffith Park and is posed by the Hollywood sign. Well, for decades, people have been trying to get a wildlife crossing, either an under crossing or some kind of over crossing along the 101. I started hearing about this back in the late 1980s because I was working with the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, and it was just this little pipe dream that maybe we could just get a little tunnel somehow under the freeway. And Caltrans, everybody else was totally opposed to it.
Right.
But the fact that P22 became literally the poster child for the need for wildlife crossing. Flash forward, last month, the ribbon cutting was held. It's going to be the largest wildlife crossing in the world. And it really all came from that one story and that one picture that made it a national geographic.
There was a lot of organizing too, and
and
a lot of fundraising. So it's but now we're spending $80 million to hope that a dozen cougars can get across the freeway to find a mate. It's incredible.
Well, it'll be cougars and bobcats and coyotes
I know.
and everything.
Go ahead.
I'm glad you said that word organizing. And one of the things, and maybe this is far afield of the science writing exposure, but I feel like there's such a lack of stories about people working together to achieve these things. And like, when was the last time you saw a union organizer on Jimmy Kimmel? It just like doesn't happen, right? And yet you see, you know, the front page New York Times about like the Amazon union organizers, right? It was like absolutely fantastic, talking about how someone goes from a completely uninitiated person to becoming a professional organizer. And I just wanted to get your all's thoughts on, you know, how is there an opportunity to move from this role of like atomized protagonist who achieves the really great thing to someone who actually creates a community and a social milieu that they get to exist in, that then creates a lot of the social proof for why you should do these things.
Well, I think it's also like, I mean, you know, one of my students, you know, had this paper about like how the small thing that you do, the individual action, turns into a collective action. And I said, like, well, I sent it back, you know, and said, like, for a rewrite, you know, which they can do, and said, like, how do you, you know, because there's a bit of magical thinking in there, you know, that, and I think that's, you know, that's the question of stories, like really telling stories about how our individual actions through whatever is organizing or other things, you know, become collective actions, because, you know, this climate crisis is not going to be solved by individual actions.
Right.
It's going to take those collective actions.
Well, look, I started in labor organizing. That was my foray into community organizing. So I'm like, please, more organizing stories. There's this book, I think it's called Playing Against the Cards or something. And it's about this guy who goes undercover in like a Florida casino it's like salters, they're like these undercover organizers, and they go in and they pretend to work at the company, and then they want to change the company from the inside out, right? And so this guy did, and he became a salter, and you know, it's a job that happens among community organizers, and I've always been like, that's a story that I want to tell, right? It's super interesting, you're going within the system to change the system, and like, there's also something, so to me it's like, that's one way to like look at, there are lots of stories about that, and I think there is so many stories about community organizing that are not told. There's also a story, a film called Pride, which is about a lot of queer organizing during this Harvey Milk and all of that. And there's also a bunch of stuff going on. I think it was in Ireland that it takes place. But anyway, another movie to look at in terms of the way you talk about community. What was it? Wales. Yeah. Apologies for anyone who's from Wales. But I would recommend sort of starting to look at some of those films, but I also think the reason why we see a lot of this stuff on the front page when it's like the Amazon people standing up or Starbucks, right? For some reason it's the capitalism of it. It's like, oh, they're standing up to get better wages and better healthcare and all those things, like standing up against capitalism and against like these major forces. Like that's a story because Amazon's part of it, because Starbucks is part of it. But when it's when it's us, you know, wanting to stand up for climate, I feel like people are less excited about that story, you know, because it feels less tangible.
Yeah.
And I always think about that. So I don't know.
It's less of a David Goliath story.
Yeah, and there's less of a resolution, as John was saying before. So I think that's kind of and the only other thing I'll say is that I think the only individual action that is the top priority is being out on the streets. Like that is, you know, if we were out on the streets every single day and anyone that could leave work did, we would have things change. But at this point, we're not doing that. And so I would say of all individual actions, that is the one, if we collectively came together and did that, we would get more results.
I'd like to speak to that one, because I think if you get out of Los Angeles and other places, I think you might find that there's a lot of that kind of community journalism where it still exists, where those stories are being told. It's just they're not getting a wide audience, but they're getting the audience where it's happening. There's a great story in Maine about a grassroots movement to create the first ever product stewardship law for plastics and containers that actually is forcing global and national companies, when they do business in Maine, to pay for the cost of recycling the trash that they're creating. It was a complete grassroots organized effort tilting against much larger powers, and it's a huge success, and it's a model now for the rest of the country. Cool. It just doesn't get told that much.
So we'll have time for, it is 3 now, we'll do one more question, but, yeah, sorry, I don't know, you had your hand up for one.
Yeah, I thought that it's just because I went to UCLA and now I'm like being nostalgic, and I'm thinking of like films in the 70s, which people my age obviously can only know if they look at them, but I was even looking at coming in the plane, I was 9 to 5, by James Bond and Lily Tomlin, or you think about Bonnie and Clyde, or you think about all these movie period time where really filmmakers in America were like, fuck this shit, we're gonna question the system as it is, and we're gonna push hard. And that has happened already. And they weren't calling it social impact. And I think that I would love to hear from both you, Ed and John, because what has happened? I mean, like, is it that we're going back a little bit to that idea of the 70s and trying to figure out a way to see that within the climate movement? But that, revelry has been before in the American filmmaking history. So what would be a way that we can get those same spirits within the climate?
The new golden age of
Brian, do you want to add something, but then we could
You're very
wrap up?
kind. So in looking for new paths for literacy, the most outrageous approach I've seen so far, and we've been studying this, is in Philadelphia. A bunch of science journalists all got together and said, wait, we're really the same. We have a responsibility in the urban environment in Philadelphia to tell the same story, but by community. So it's called Resolve Philly. So the science journalists in multiple communities within the entire area of Philadelphia tell the same story, but include the scientists from the community that's well trusted, include a religious person in the community that people are that's respected, and they actually run the same story in 5 different places with different viewpoints being expressed. So at the same time, this is pretty wild, right? At the same time, it's a coordinated attempt to educate, but through curbside science information, through the people that people trust. So rather than having one voice of one writer in one paper in one little corner of the world that may or may not get picked up, the science journalists are coordinating their relationships and actually saying, we have to tell the mothers in Philadelphia what the real story is about milk, what they should get, what they should use, and how they should actually use it. It's the most creative I've seen, and it is a sense of community, and it fosters a sort of technical, relationship. But then again, it causes us to have a little view to say, can we all do this together? And they're doing it in Philly. So we just started a study in North Carolina and a few other places to see if that can happen at the same time. Because we're all about in lifting all ships anyway, right? So why not all have one voice with multiple elements that help support the end result of the solution? Wildly creative. Takes a lot of work. It's community building.
So we had from the streets of Philadelphia to the big decadal view of changes in narrative changes.
Wow. Not sure how we tie that a little bit.
I mean, I talk to him every day, so I feel like answer that.
I would like to write the Bonnie and Clyde of climate for sure. I mean,
all right,
that kind of storytelling is the auteur cinema that you're talking about versus the kind of the sequel factory we're seeing a lot now. I would love to see a return to that and embrace that kind of wild creativity in how we tell this story. It's challenging to do. It's challenging to find a place for it, and then it's challenging to get an audience. But wow, something to shoot for.
Yeah, but there's also so many opportunities now. I mean, it's such a big, huge, hungry maw. With the streamers and everything, I think there are opportunities to tell those stories as a 90-minute narrative or a 6-part series or whatever it might be. And I like the idea
the shock team of climate science writing.
Yeah, I think I think that is one of the interesting challenges, for journalists and media outlets, is to figure out how to collaborate with each other for the kinds of good, outcomes and impact that you'd like to see in your communities. And I think it's been happening. It's happened at various times in various places in these isolated ways, and it would be wonderful to see it at a broader scale. There is something akin to what Monica Guzman is doing in her work that she talks about in that book. I never thought of it that way. It's trying to have these dialogues across divides.
Yes.
And I just want to say thank you this has been really fun and interesting and generative for me, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, also, if you go to HollywoodClimateSummit.com, our event is from the 22nd to the 26th of June. There's in-person and digital events, and it's sponsored by a lot of the big studios. Please come. I'll also put up a QR code here, and you can just do it and sign up if you want.